Chapter 5. The OP. Two figures wandered down the street, both wearing dark, nondescript work clothes bought from local sources, one with a duffel bag thrown over a shoulder, walking at a leisurely pace. If you were watching them as a trained observer, you might notice that one of the men was slightly oddly proportioned, a bit too heavily muscled, moving a bit too stiffly for a healthy adult. You might also notice that the slimmer of the two was leaning slightly to one side, as though his duffel was carrying gear that was far heavier than the usual apparel toted by someone in an industrial slum. But there were no trained observers sat at the border of Sadie that evening, just tired workers at the end of a shift, sat on cheap furniture outside a seemingly endless supply of shitty pubs, nursing warm beers or necking shots of a clear fluid known locally as Slevo, according to Grow the Guilty. Whichever got drunk looked to depend on the age of the person drinking. The old boys and girls drank their Slevo in moody silence, soaking in the last rays of early summer sun as it began to dip below the ever-present Mar Nosso skyline and the mountains beyond. The younger patrons drank their beers and conversed loudly in groups large and small, just grateful to be at the end of another day before repeating it all again tomorrow. No, there weren't any trained observers among them, but you didn't need to be a recce soldier to notice off-worlders. Immigrants from Solo Nobre were allowed passes to come and go from the refugee camp as they pleased, under controlled conditions, but they mostly went straight to Mar Nosso to seek out their fortunes, or just act like tourists. The dark faces and powerful builds of Nobrean soldiery was not yet a common sight among the port city of Posadichny, and the locals made this known by stopping to stare at the foreigners in their midst. Gus and Valka just carried on past a parade of pubs and closed shopfronts, dull grey architecture matching the dull grey looks they received from the populace. Not malicious or hostile, not yet anyway, just wary. Gus kept his eyes forward, trying desperately to not look as though he was making a beeline for the flophouse. Valka, the far more experienced recce man, looked around, not like a tourist, more like a professional on shore leave, looking for a suitably shitty bar to drown his sorrows in. He actively scrutinized the local pubs as they passed, eyeing them up and down, meeting the looks of several locals and giving them a nod of acknowledgement, forcing them to either look away awkwardly or nod in reply. Any good cover story was based on a kernel of truth, and Pilgrim's was that they were mercenaries looking for work on a new planet, away from prying eyes in Mar Nosso. Anyone looking at the two off-worlders could believe that, based on their appearance and bearing. No need to pretend to have another job. No need to pretend to be tourists. They were soldiers for hire. As it happened, the locals were not interested in accosting a pair of dangerous-looking foreigners, so the walk to Capac went without incident. "This looks like a place we can get shit-faced in and pass out for a few days," Gus said as they approached the crumbling facade, and Valka loudly agreed. The big cyborg shouldered the heavy wooden door open and stepped into a surprisingly clean reception area, lined on both sides with chairs and fake plants to add a bit of colour to the otherwise utilitarian decor. A few people were dotted here and there in the initial area, quietly drinking alone, lost in their own little worlds, and Valka confidently strode past them to the reception desk/front bar, where a bored-looking heavy-set woman eyed them suspiciously. "Da," she said as the men approached. Valka cleared his throat before butchering in basic. Need room, we two. Look, Mar Nosso, we need." The woman raised an eyebrow in apparent mirth, then switched to pitch-perfect basic. "You want a room looking up the hill? How long do you want to stay for?" Valka screwed his face up in concentration before just sticking up 2 alloy fingers. 2 nights, got it." The receptionist tippy-tapped on a small digital display that hung from her belt on a retractable cord and showed the display to the pair. Gus and Valka had no idea the worth of local currency, and didn't particularly care, so Gus just fished for one of the many small plastic baggies in his pocket and put it on the bar top. The lady frowned, then her eyes widened upon seeing the rough-cut diamonds in the bag, before snatching the bag up and depositing it in one of the many pockets on her outfit. "Bloody hell! You can move in for that much." The two recce men weren't 100% sure what she was saying, but could gather that they'd possibly paid a bit over the odds. No matter, they'd be out of there within a day or so, and within the year Mar Nosso would be riddled with Nobraean tool diamonds, so it hardly mattered. Gus gestured to the selection of booze behind the woman. 4 beer, 4 slevo, he said with the appropriate number of fingers, which got a scowl from Valka. "Why the fuck not?" he said in his native tongue, as the lady quickly and efficiently served up. "We're on leave, right?" Valka shrugged, picking up the tray of beverages in one hand and their room key in another. "Whatever, little brother. Let's do this." The woman pointed to a set of stairs in the corner, partially obscured by the big fake plants, and sent them on their way with a huge grin on her face. She was probably intending to retire soon as her shift ended. The room was small and sparsely decorated, but clean, with one double bed and a pull-out couch, and a desk in the far corner with a lamp, which got turned off as soon as they entered. In the near corner, next to the door, was a tiny ensuite consisting of a shower and toilet sink combo, like a prison with the sink mounted directly above the toilet. All in all, the recce boys had lived in worse conditions. Gus dumped their duffel on the bed and the drinks on the desk. Valka locked the door as Gus did 2 shots of slevo with a grimace in between, shaking his head violently. "Fuck me, that's rank." Valka laughed at him, and the older man pulled a spare bedsheet from the small locker at the end of the bed, then retrieved some tape and string from his bag. "One moment," Gus told his comrade once he saw what was up. "Need to do a comms check." He grabbed one of the small handheld radios Grau had managed to source from some dodgy dock workers and switched it on. This was the first thing that had to be done before setting up any OP. No comms, no operation, so the saying goes, and the site would have to be moved. "Boss, Pilgrim 2, check." "Boss, okay." Anna's voice crackled back almost immediately. "Pilgrim 2, okay. We're on task as of now. Out." And with that, Gus turned his radio off to conserve the battery. The recce pair were the trigger for this op, and Anna didn't need live reporting, so she and the others would be sitting there waiting for anything relevant to come through. If they needed to initiate comms for whatever reason, they could just walk down the road and knock on the door. Gus put his radio on the desk alongside the booze, then moved to the curtains and gave one look outside before pulling them almost closed, leaving about an inch gap between the 2 pieces of material. Grabbing a small knife from his pocket, Gus started stabbing holes through the long edge of the sheet, while Valka held it and threaded the string through the holes like a shoelace. When the full length was run through, the men pulled it taut and taped it to the ceiling about a foot back from the window, plunging the room into darkness in the rapidly failing light of the evening. Gus then dragged the bed closer to the window and sat on the side of it, stabbing a small aperture at eye level through the sheet. He poked a small spotting scope through this, a pair of old binoculars that Grau had sourced, sawn in half at the bracket so each man could have one eye. Gus had taped a small section of burlap over the lens and poked several holes in it to allow him to see through, whilst eliminating glint that may give their position away. Through this, he could look at the target compound unseen, and if the room remained dark, all anybody looking back would see would be closed curtains in an unoccupied room. They didn't have any camera gear, so the watching would have to be done the old-fashioned way, maximum focus, staring through the tiny hole. This method gets tiring very quickly, so the pair agreed to do 30-minute shifts to start, extending as they got settled to allow for a bit of sleep. Valka handed Gus a notebook and a pencil, and Gus immediately started sketching the layout of the compound from their elevated position, noting any relevant details. While he was doing this, Valka laid out their assault gear on the bed, prepping in the gloom via the light of a right-angled torch with a red filter over it. It wasn't much, a fact nobody was happy about, but it would do in a pinch. Each man's gear was near identical, with the only differences being their weapons. Their gear consisted of a grab bag, looking like it was repurposed from earlier duties carrying claymore mines, and inside that was spare ammo, about 30 rounds apiece, an improvised flash bomb that Marco had shown them how to make, a small trauma kit, balaclava, gloves, and their squad radios. It was about as bare bones as it gets, and Valka harumphed as he looked at the sorry lot, before packing it all into the grab bags and laying them by the door, each man's weapon laid across the top. "This is a great spot," Gus said absently as he doodled away. "Marco did good." "Of course he did, brother. He's a fucking legend." "That he is. I can see both entrances from here. The compound has a parking area with a small truck in there." "We could extract Nemi with that if we need to," Valka pointed out. "Aye, we could," Gus replied. "Or we could use it to block the door after we've breached it." "No chance of going over the wall?" Gus focused on the outer perimeter. "Not worth it. They've barbed wire and broken glass fixed in concrete or something. More trouble than it's worth." "Roger. Door it is." "Yeah." Gus resumed scanning the compound. "It seems they've one dude on patrol within the perimeter, with at least one more dude inside the building, judging by the lights on. Of course, he couldn't see the rear of the building, but you don't report assumptions. He saw 2 guys, so that's what he wrote down. Discipline looks lackadaisical so far. The guy outside clearly doesn't give a fuck," he said with a smile. "Probably been there for hours, man." Valka sat down next to Gus and handed him a beer, sipping from one himself. He took the notepad and glanced over it with his red light. "Shame we can't see the bottom floor from here. Would be nice to see how heavy the door is." "Yeah, windows are a possibility." Gus looked away from the optic and stared at his buddy, teeth shining in the dull red light. "Or we could send our mini-mug to breach the fucking wall." "Fuck you," Valka said half-heartedly. He was thinking about other things. "Something about this seemed wrong to you," he said, after draining most of a beer. "Everything about this seems wrong to me." "No, about Nemi, I mean." Gus glanced at him before looking back through his optic. Valka explained. "You're a Billy Big Balls Brigador, just done smashing the city up, killing civvies, burning down orphanages or whatever, and the concern flies you out to their HQ world, showers you with riches and invites you to some fucked up festival in your honour. I think I see where you're going with this." Gus took over, playing out his train of thought. "So the first thing Nemi does, full of money and booze, is join a local security company doing residential work on partially abandoned industrial sites." He looked at his friend again long enough to say, "Yeah, it's fucked up." Gus annotated his sketch with a few lines and numbers to suggest scale, and settled his eye back to the scope. "What did Grau have to say about him?" Gus asked after a time. "What, about Nemi?" "Yeah. I saw you grilling him earlier when you should have been helping me finish up the lightproofing back at the patrol base." Valka cuffed him playfully, to which Gus threw an awkward seated kick that clunked from a metal shin without any apparent effect. "Stop complaining, new guy. Perks of being senior, man." "Shut up, you big dumb fuck. I've been in nearly 12 years. I'm a fucking NCO in the infantry." "Yeah, and only 1 year in recon. So you're the fucking new guy," Valka said flatly, in the tone of someone who'd explained this very thing 1,000 times to an idiot. "Whatever." Gus shrugged it off as he always did. "What did he tell you?" "Well," Valka started in a conspiratorial voice, "he says this Nemi guy has his brain full of fancy spacer shit that tells him what to do. Says it controls his body if he tries going against the rules. That's why he drinks. That's also probably why he joined a local security company, now I think of it," Valka finished. Gus looked at his colleague with a face that clearly meant, "Are you fucking kidding me?" "No joke," Valka said, hands raised to show his sincerity. "That and his wife and kids were killed or something." Gus barked out a laugh. "Fuck me," he said. "I nearly feel sorry for him now." He thought for a moment before going on. "I tell you what, though. The tech in his head can't have very strict rules considering what he's just done to our city." "Corporate legislation, I imagine," Valka bounced back. "He has to stick to whatever rules he's contracted to, not like moral programming or anything. I suppose you'd know, Minimog. You got the same stuff in your head, but it just makes you jerk it to NEP field manuals every morning. Valka cuffed him again, but couldn't help himself from laughing along this time. What's your fucking arcs, new guy? He checked his watch, synchronized to local time as part of the orders process.
Gonna power nap. Wake me up in 20.
I'll stab you in your fucking sleep, you keep whacking me round the head. Valka laughed as he lay down to snooze.